Welcome to our webinar, Future Proof Your CERs for 2026, Meet Notified Body Expectations for Audit-Ready Systematic Literature Reviews. This was a very popular topic. We had a huge number of people pre-register for this webinar, and I'm guessing that many of you either have gone through a notified body audit of your lit reviews or are expecting one in the near future. So we're excited to present this topic. We've got two great presenters who are living this on a regular basis. Celegence, as quick background, is a consulting company. We conduct a lot of systematic literature reviews on behalf of medical device and diagnostics clients, and we also write the full CERs. So we do a lot of these, and as a result, we support our clients with quite a few notified body audits, and we've got a lot of great lessons learned on how to future-proof and make sure that your literature reviews are ready for those audits. On our panel today, we have two experts. Dr. Neha Keral is our Associate Manager for Medical Device Services. And then Smridula Hariharan is our Senior Manager of Medical Device Services. And both of them have done literally hundreds of these systematic literature reviews, worked with clients going through the notified body audits, and have lived and breathed this topic. So we're very happy to share what we've learned, and we hope you find it helpful as well. As I mentioned, we're a consulting company, so we support both medical device and pharmaceutical clients across a range of services, including a lot of MDR, medical writing, CER, systematic literature reviews, all of the post-market documentation. If we can go over to the next slide. And one unique thing about us is we do use quite a bit of in-house technology that we've built. The technology is available. If we do this as a service, we always use, for example, on our literature reviews, we always use our Captus technology, which uses AI to support us with the data extraction. And then we can bring that directly into the CERs, for example, which are also written in Captus. And the technology does help us quite a bit, and it makes it easier to make sure that everything is in place for those notified body audits. The tips that our panelists are going to share with you today, can be done both manually with other tools or with our technology. So nothing's unique to the technology, but the technology certainly makes our lives easier and makes it faster to do those systematic literature reviews and then embed them into a full CER. So with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Neha, and she and Smridula are going to walk you through the systematic literature reviews and what we've learned to make them as buttoned up and future-proof as possible for notified body audits. Dr. Neha?
Yeah, thank you, Erin, for the introduction. I welcome everyone on this session. Thank you for joining today's session on strengthening clinical evaluation reports using high quality evidence from systematic literature reviews. So the agenda for today is we'll be covering overview of SLRs. We definitely will be covering how to handle the data generated from SLRs, benefit risk assessment, and then mapping GSPRs, clinical evidence, and claims. We will also be sharing some of our roadblock experiences with you, along with the solution to address those in the form of case studies. And then we will park some time for the questions and answer session. So, definitely by the end of this webinar, you will have a clear understanding of how structured evidence from the SLR drives a strong clinical justifications. Next slide, please.
And I'll just quickly add, when we get to the end, we will have some time for Q&A, and there's a tab in Zoom that'll say Q&A. You can type your questions there, and we'll go over as many of those as we can.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Erin, for that. So we are talking about why systematic literature reviews are so important. So SLRs is essential in building strong, defendable clinical evidence. By using structured and unbiased approach, SLRs ensures us to capture all the relevant data, just not the clinical studies. Every step of the process is fully transparent and transferable, and that is where the notified bodies will look to verify evidence pathways. The outcomes we extract directly support safety performance justification, showing how the device performs in clinical practice and identifying any potential risk. This consolidated evidence also strengthens our benefit risk assessment, confirming that device benefits continue to outweigh the residual risk. So, finally, the SLR allows us to validate claims and labeling with confidence, ensuring that we are just looking at the claims which have solid clinical data presented in the report. So, ultimately, SLR is not just a literature exercise, it's a backbone for credible clinical evaluation. Next slide, please. So we have often seen that there have been challenges while doing SLR, and one of the challenges regulators now expect a highly structured, traceable, and reproducible process. Any gaps can result in non-conformities. They also want to see how we have handled large volume of data, how it is screened, and how the new evidences which keeps on emerging on a day-to-day basis, how we handle those data. So with the mostly manual process, there is a high risk of bias and inconsistencies. So the main pressure today lies in the regulatory scrutiny, data volume, evolving evidence, and reproducibility. And those are exactly we are going to address in this session. Kelly, over to you for the poll question. Kelly will be sharing a poll question with you to capture your top challenges while working on clinical evaluation. Kelly, over to you.
I'm very curious what the audience response is going to be from this, knowing that we've seen all three of these come up in our work.
Betting my money on A. I feel like that's the one that people struggle with. One of the attendees seems to have their hands raised. Do we?
I think let's hold questions for the end. So if you've got a question, type it into the Q&A and we'll tackle that at the end. Oh, you called it. It was A, but just barely.
Oh wow, Smridula, we were correct. So most of the challenges evolve around clinically relevant endpoints and how to define it. And majorly, it's for the legacy devices. It's very difficult to get those clinical endpoints.
Agreed.
Yeah. So yeah, we will be covering all these data points, clinically relevant endpoints, conducting benefit risk ratio assessment, and mapping the hierarchy of scientific evidence in the following slides as well. Next slide, please. So once we have done the systematic literature reviews, the point comes in how we are going to use the literature or how we are going to use the large volume of data for to define the clinical endpoints. Before we move to the clinical endpoints, we should make ourselves aware with some of the key concepts where the regulators most emphasize for. And now these days, the regulators now examine with high level of scrutiny. So to begin with, clinical performance, which tells us how efficiently the device achieves its intended medical purpose in real world clinical use. For example, a diagnostic device, whether it's able to detect the target analyte or not, or if we are looking for an implant or a dental implant, whether it's able to deliver the intended mechanical support or functionality or not. Importantly, this evidence must directly align with the performance claims. In most of the scenarios, we have seen that manufacturers mostly misinterpret the clinical performance with the technical performance. So we should clearly define our clinical performance of the device. And next, once we evaluate the clinical performance, we should be defining the clinical benefit, the value that patients gain from the device in practice. This includes measurable improvements. For example, the benefit device may have, the device may reduce symptoms, better function, or may enhance the quality of life. So regulators these days want us to clearly convey what benefit is expected out of the device, how much benefit patients experience, who is mostly likely to get the benefit, how long the benefit lasts, and whether the device is addressing any unmet clinical need. When we then assess the robustness of the results to confidence intervals and margins. Definitely, confidence intervals helps us to understand the precision of the clinical data, and margins are crucial when making non-inferiority or superiority claims. Next slide, please. So all these components directly feed into benefit risk determination, which is emphasized to EU including Article 6110, 61.2, 82 and 86. So the expectations are quite clear. Defendable justification that patients benefit significantly outweigh the known risk. And once we have consider benefit risk determination, then comes the level of clinical evidence, how we are going to um, level the clinical evidence with the GSPRs. And it is not majorly leveling the clinical evidence, just evidence-based medicine hierarchies. So as per MDCG 2026 Appendix 3, not only the clinical studies should be marked as a level of clinical evidence, even the non-clinical and the PMS data should be marked on the level of clinical evidence. For example, clinical studies can be ranked as level one of clinical evidence, while the PMS data or the complaints data can be ranked as level of at rank at 7. So once we have defined all these terminologies, we are clear with all these key concepts defined by EUMDR. We should be moving ahead towards a structured framework to define the clinical endpoints. For defining clinical endpoints, the first step should be to identify claims. All claims must be extracted from IFU, labeling, or any promotional materials, even the manufacturer's website. We should make sure that each claim must be mapped with the relevant GSPR requirement, should be supported by verifiable clinical evidence, and be associated with measurable clinical endpoints. Because claims drive the entire clinical evaluation, accuracy and precision are absolutely essential, and we should be looking at the claims. If the claims are unsupported or overstated, then that needs to be reworked, and that needs immediate attention. Once we define the claims, we transition to endpoint selection. To do this, we typically run a focus search on benchmark or equivalent devices to understand which endpoints are most commonly evaluated for that particular technology. Endpoints can be categorized into primary endpoints and the secondary endpoints. The primary endpoints will demonstrate the patient relevant outcomes of or what we say the clinical performance or benefit of the device directly, while the secondary endpoints can evolve around the safety profile. We should be mindful while determining the endpoint that these endpoints should be measurable, can be validated, clinically relevant, meaningful to the patients and the providers, and appropriate with respect to the risk classification of the device and the clinical context. Once we are done with defining the clinical endpoints, it is very important to establish acceptance criteria, so confidence intervals and margins. So, confidence intervals helps us to define the precision of the clinical data, while margins also help us to reflect how non-superior or over-superior our data is. So, we should be very careful while mentioning the confidence intervals and margins, and we should document exactly how the margins are derived. So, overall, this structured approach ensures that the claims, endpoints, and evidence are tightly linked to each other, justified, reducing ambiguity, and supporting a reviewer-ready CER. Next slide, please. Once we are done defining the endpoints, then comes how we are going to do a benefit risk determination. The endpoints make us give us the data to determine what benefit the device might have. So where the central output benefit risk analysis becomes the central output of the CR. So for this, we just break down it into three simple questions. What are benefits? Benefits come from the intended clinical outcomes of the device, which might revolve around improved function of the device, faster healing, procedural efficiency, or reduced complications. Most importantly, these benefits can vary depending on the usual clinical technique and the patient characteristics. Then we come across what are risks. Risk may be inherent to the device, um, could be like an implant fracture or adverse reactions due to the materials used for that device. So, similarly, like benefits, user skill level and patient factors influence a very important role. And how is benefit risk determined as defined in EU MDR? This determination requires a holistic approach. We should look all the safety and performance data. We should also look at the clinical relevance of the benefits, risk, probability, and severity, and then finally the intended purpose and the patient population. When we consider defining a benefit risk assessment, the classification of the device plays a major role. So our objective is to demonstrate that benefits outweighs the residual risk and that risk cannot be reduced further without compromising performance. Next slide, please. So, as we move forward for defining using the clinical endpoints and fitting the clinical endpoints into benefit risk assessment, it is important to understand how this assessment is expected to be demonstrated but today under EU MDR. Historically, manufacturers used to rely heavily on the qualitative benefit risk assessment. These are based on expert opinions, past experiences, or descriptive reasoning. They are still valuable, especially when clinical data is limited or when the device technology is a novel device technology or the device has some indirect benefits like diagnostic or the decision supporting tools. However, the shift has been seen from the notified body observers that they want to look into the quantitative approach of the benefit risk assessment. The quantitative approach help us to measure the benefit risk numerically, evaluate probability, severity, and impact of the outcomes, apply confidence intervals and margins, and compare the results with the state-of-the-art benchmarks and demonstrate that benefit clearly outweigh the residual risk. So, in this slide, we have majorly focused on one of the common technique, quantitative technique, where we grade the benefits and the risk into different weightages, and the highest benefit will have the highest weightage, while in a similar manner, the highest risk will have the highest weightage. So we take account of all the benefits of the device. There can be multiple or single benefit, and there can be a multiple or single risk to the device. So when we talk about benefit risk, we are not talking about just benefit or risk. A device can have multiple benefits and risks. Moving to next slide. So benefit risk ratio is considered as a ratio of the weighted average of all the benefits, like I mentioned before in the previous slide, that a device might have single benefit or device might have multiple benefit. So it should be a weighted average of all the benefits versus the weighted average of all the risks. And as I mentioned previously in my previous slides, the benefit and risk are impacted by the use error and also the patients to which these devices are exposed for. So the expectation is that the ratio should be greater than 1, meaning that the expected clinical benefit clearly outweighs the associated risk. So as we have seen, clinical evidence provides evidence foundation, benefit risk determination provides regulatory justification, and quantitative analysis ensures credibility, consistency, and compliance. So ultimately, the goal is to show beyond reasonable doubt that intended benefits of the patient significantly outweigh the potential risk. Smridula will be taking us through some of the pitfall challenges while we determine benefit risk. Over to you, Smridula.
Thank you, Neha. That was very
Yeah,
informative. Um,
yeah.
can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So I'll just start off with Neha's covered a lot of important points, like what benefits are, what claims are, what performance claims are. We've seen a lot of times that we get confused between the features of a device versus what the clinical performance claims are. By the name itself, it's implied that a clinical performance should have an effect, a clinical effect on the patient. Ideally, there are devices where it is of benefit to the user rather than the patient. But in that scenario as well, you'll have to call out what the benefit is rather than just saying the feature of the device. For example, if you have like a catheter and you say it has a hydrophilic coating, that's a technical characteristic or a feature of the device. But the claim that goes with the hydrophilic coating is that it steers very easily, it moves very smoothly through the anatomy, and then the endpoint that you want to associate with that is what is my procedural success rate when I use this device with the hydrophilic coating, or what is the number of vascular dissections that I have when I use this device with a hydrophilic coating. So you link everything that you have with your device to your benefits and your endpoints. I would say Neha's already covered a good starting point is your literature review, where you get to see what are other people researching, what are the outcomes that they're looking at, do these outcomes make sense for what I want to claim for my device. Another important source of information where you want to look at before you decide your claims and benefits is your user needs document. So you know then what you want your device to do. Do I want it to perform at par with something that's already in the market? Do I want it to be better than something? Is there a feature that makes it, makes the risk lower, that makes the benefit higher? Based on your user needs, you can come up with your claims and benefits. It's important to have benefits that are geared around both performance as well as safety. And then once you set this well, you're setting up yourself for success. If you have your claims, benefits, and endpoints well framed, it's very likely that your benefit risk assessment also will go smoothly. If you have vague benefits, it gets very difficult to quantify them. It gets very difficult to find data within either literature or internal test reports, your internal studies to support these benefits. Then it becomes a matter of not that you don't have enough data, but you don't know how to present the data that you have to support the claim that you're making. There's often times we compare with the wrong thing. So when you're comparing with state of the art, it's important to note what you want to compare it to. if my marketing claim is I am better than the current gold standard, you have to prove that in your CR. But if you're, say, choosing the wrong gold standard, or if you're comparing it instead with something that's, that's something that's new, something that's just come onto the market, you're likely not going to reach that endpoint where you're saying, I am going to show that my safety is better than, or my performance is better than this device. And it's in a sense, it's because you've claimed the wrong thing, not that you don't have the data to support it. Also, there's a number of times where we don't identify all of the risks, meaning there are certain risks, like say it's a low severity risk, like something like a headache. We would say, okay, that's just a headache, we don't need to consider this in the benefit risk analysis, but that often comes back. If your headache is occurring very frequently, if it's, say, 60 out of every 100 patients is having a headache when they use your device, you have to consider it in your benefit risk analysis. Even small benefits like that, say there's quality of life improvement measured maybe just a month or so after use of the device. If there's a way to get that in, then it's good to consider it in your benefit risk analysis. There's also sometimes a lack of flow between your benefit risk analysis, your risk documentation, your PMS. Everything that you identify in your CER should flow back to your risk file, should flow back to your PMS documentation. And we've sometimes seen that the PMS structures that most companies have set up are very reactive. You collect data, but there's not much proactive PMS being done, which helps to address a lot of gaps in data. So if the more PMS activities there are, the more data you're going to be able to collect, and the more you're going to be able to quantify your benefit risk ratio. So that's all of the pitfalls that I can think of. Neha, if there's any that I've missed, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Smridula. You covered it all. Thank you. Moving ahead, next slide, please. Once we have defined the clinical endpoints, we have done the benefit risk assessment. The next important step is how we are going to map those with the GSPRs. And we have seen that of lately, all the notified body wants us to map the clinical data with the clinical claims with the relevant GSPRs. So starting from the left, the first outcome I can see is demonstrating evidence-based compliance. Every claim we make, whether it relates to the safety, clinical performance, functionality, should be backed with the right level of scientific evidence. Major claims or major performance or safety claims should be supported by high level of clinical data, while the design and technical claims can rely on bench testing or in vitro studies. So the hierarchy of evidence is must for the hierarchy of claims. Second piece is the traceability. We create a clear map that shows that every claim is supported by a evidence, and then it specifies the GSPR requirements. This gives a notified body a full visibility that none of the claims are overstated or understated, and it strengthens and gives confidence to the device performance. Next is the regulatory review efficiency. When everything is aligned, claims, evidence level, and GSPR, reviewers can easily check the appropriateness of the risk class, intended purpose, and clinical context. A well-mapped file reduces follow-up questions, delays, and unexpected observations. And the fourth component, it helps us to identify the gap. Mapping doesn't only show that what data we have it also help us to reveal what we do not have, the missing clinical data, evidence if something is outdated or insufficient, or if the looking at the classification of the device, if it's a high risk classified device, whether that is supported by a high level of clinical evidence, or we need still more evidence. This also gives us a risk based justification that emphasizes that higher risk claims should be backed by a high clinical evidence. So definitely, in summary, I would say that mapping a hierarchy of scientific evidence to GSPRs is not, it's not just a documentation risk task. It is a strategic tool to ensure that we have defendable and compliant claims. enhance transparency and audit readiness, drives early detection of evidence and gaps, and strengthens the benefit risk justification. I think it's a time for our next poll question. Kelly will be launching our next questionnaire. Over to you, Kelly. Yeah. Based on your experience, Smridula, what's your biggest challenge when you get a notified body you back and where we work at the most?
I feel like it's between the equivalent section and the benefit risk conclusion. I think that's the one where
Yes,
we get the most NV comments.
I do agree. Yeah. And sometimes it might lie upon the clinical evidence appraisal also. So
Yeah.
let's see what people face globally
I
as a
feel like I want to
challenge.
check all 5 of these. You made it tough with the most.
Yeah,
Oh,
oh
that is
wow, the
almost
poll
even.
results
Look
are
at that.
interesting. Yeah,
The
that's nice
equivalent
to
is
see the
apparently
yeah,
a tricky spot for everyone.
yes.
Okay, I think we can move to the next slide.
Next, like yeah. And
Um,
Smridula will be taking us through the checklist.
yeah.
Over to you,
So
Smridula. Yeah.
yeah. So I'm going to take you through some of the tips and tricks that we implement here to make sure that our CERs don't get too many notified body comments back. There is always a subjective element in the review. So no matter how thorough you are, there are bound to be a couple of questions, but at least hopefully with implementing these, you'll be able to bring those down to a minimum. We find that checklists are the most efficient and effective way to bring down these notified body comments. So when I say checklist, it's not, is my TOC in place? Is my appendix right? It's more towards, have I satisfied the requirements of MDR? Have I followed the nitty-gritties as laid out in the MDCG guidances? There's a lot of material out there that helps us determine if our CER is complete or not. And incorporating this in the form of a checklist is the smartest way to make sure that we have everything that we need in our clinical evaluation. There are often scenarios where we find that the claims are unsupported or we don't have enough support for certain standards that we've claimed that our device is relevant to. So having this step prior to releasing your CER ensures that we've checked all of these boxes. We know of all of the gaps, and we've either addressed these gaps by doing some testing or providing a suitable justification in the CER. You can go to the next slide, Kelly. Very often I find that it's not that we're not presenting the data that's the issue, but we've not given any indication as to why that data is not there is the issue. So when you have a justification for your gaps, it is usually accepted. And maybe sometimes even a plan to address these gaps in the future, which is in the form of, say, a PMCF or future non-clinical testing, it is often accepted by the notified body. So what we like to do is there are 2 checklists that I want to take you through. One is the general, map to your MDR requirements, map it to your GSPRs. Are all of my clinically relevant GSPRs suitably covered in my CER? Are all of the MDR requirements suitably covered? For instance, do I clearly call out the route of conformity that I want to follow in my CER? Am I claiming equivalence? If yes, is it to a device that's in-house, or is it a competitor device? If it's a competitor device, do I have sufficient level of access? are all of my GSPRs sufficiently supported by data? What data is available to support these GSPRs? Is this clinical, non-clinical? If it's non-clinical, am I going 6110, or is that not a suitable pathway for me? So these are the kind of checklists that we have to implement. And finally, is there a link between all of my PMS documents? Is the CER flowing into my PMS? Is the PMS um, flowing into my risk management? Is it going into my IFU? If yes, how often, how effectively? So these are some things that we like to focus on when we do our GSPRs, when we do our checklists. And then the second one is we're often questioned on the sufficiency of our clinical evidence. So how do we determine, is my clinical data sufficient to support what I'm claiming? So I would say the very first step is, what risk class is your device? Is your device a very high risk device? Then ideally what we've seen so far is it should have a good amount of data, a good amount of patient-centric in-field data that's coming for your device. Then the second thing that you want to consider is it novel, or is it something that's based on technology that's been around and been unchanged for a really long time? So basically, is it well-established technology or not? And then finally, if it's not well-established technology, are there similar devices like my device that are available in the market? So all of this will help you determine how much data you need to support your device, and that's where the hierarchy of clinical evidence comes in. There's a nice little table, a list that comes in the MDCG 2026 that gives you, essentially calls out what kind of data you need for each of your different types of devices. So if it's like a legacy device, a well-established technology, you can rely quite heavily on your PMS data. You can rely quite heavily on state-of-the-art data. If it's a high-risk class 3 new device, it's essential that you have high-quality information, from randomized control studies, from cohort studies. Things like case reports would be really low down on the list. So if you have a lot of other data, you can rely on case reports to maybe identify rare risks, but not use it entirely to support your safety and performance. So that list, ticking off, okay, I have, say, 10 data sources. Where does it fall on this? How many patients come into each of these categories, and how many overall, patient data do I have? That'll help you understand, is my data sufficient? It's sometimes not very obvious, but sometimes when all you have is, say, case reports, you know for a fact that I don't have enough data. So even before I submit my CER, what do I do to either generate more information or to find more information that's already available? So do I choose the equivalence pathway? So if you implement this at the very beginning when you're doing your CER, it'll help you avoid a lot of waste at the end in order to switch your route of conformity. So I suggest having this right at the very beginning. What data sets do I have? Where does it fall? Is it sufficient? And once you've done that, you can move on to the next step. Can we go to the next slide, Kelly? So I always say that there needs to be bidirectional traceability. We have seen a lot of bulky CERs, and it's not wrong to give more information, but it's always nicer to have clean, concise, clear-cut information in your CER. So one is forward traceability. This is my claim. Does it have evidence to support it? Where is this evidence coming from? Is it in accordance with the GSPR requirements for that particular claim? Second is a backward traceability. This data, is it important? Does it need to be in my CER? Is it supporting something that I'm claiming? Is it supporting something that I need to prove in my CER? Let me give you an example. Say your device was earlier, prior to, say, CE marking, was made of a material that you had biocompatibility testing on. The material is now no longer a part of your device and you've replaced it with a new device. Do you still want that previous biocompatibility testing to be in your CER? Not really. It doesn't need to be in there. You can call it out in your design history, but then present only the biocompatibility testing of the new material. The old one doesn't need to be in there. Again, not wrong if you have it in there, but it's better to keep it as light as possible. We also find that when you have like a very broad indication or a very broad claim, it tends to club everything together, and then finding the evidence to support that broad claim gets very difficult. So you try to keep the claim as simple as possible, and each claim has its own unique set of evidence, and you present each claim separately so that it's clearly traceable and trackable for the notified body. They're not searching, does this claim have its support? Does this indication have its support? And as transparent as possible. If something doesn't have enough evidence, or if you've claimed, I am at par with the state of the art, but you're not able to prove that, you call that deficiency out and then say it's going to be addressed either through PMCF, or it's going to be addressed through future testing, or we're implementing a CAPA. It's best to be transparent in what kind of gaps we're finding in the CER and how we want to address this. Or do we want to monitor for a while longer? If yes, what is the justification for doing that? And this is actually the way that the NBs use their checklist as well. We've had meetings with certain reviewers who've said, yeah, we use the checklist. We use these checklists to run it against your CR, to run it against your technical documentation, to see, have you covered everything? Is everything that's required from the MDR, is it covered in your CR? So if you're implementing that prior to sending it to them, it's likely that you're going to catch at least some of the comments that may come from the notified body. Can we go to the next slide, Kelly? So these are some of the reference documents or MDCG documents, as well as MedDev documents that help in preparing a comprehensive checklist. You could read through it. 2013 has a CER template. 2026 basically helps you with that hierarchy of clinical evidence. It has that table that you can rely on. Clinical equivalence, you can strongly rely on MDCG 2025. I know a lot of people said that they have issues with the clinical equivalence section of the CER. So maybe we can just do one example of how we had issues with claiming equivalence as well, and how we sorted it. It's not a part of the case studies, but since that came back as one of the major issues that you'll face, maybe we can do one. So we've seen that earlier, at least, all of us were under the impression that if you did not have a contract in place, you could not utilize data from a competitor device. But that's no longer true. BSI had a webinar that they released that clearly called out that class 3 devices or 2B implantables did require to have a contract in place. But for anything below that risk class, a contract was not mandatory. If you had access to data either through their 510K or their website, or they release sufficient information that you were able to prove, demonstrate clinical equivalence, you could still claim equivalence to a competitor device. When you're choosing an equivalent device, I think the method that we follow is we do, again, it all comes down to the literature search. We like to do a literature search, see how many hits you're getting for the different competitors, and we pick the competitor that has the highest number of hits. Then we go and do our background research. Is this really similar to our device? Does this have, sufficient evidence available? And if there is sufficient evidence available, non-negotiables are it has to be the same clinical indication, but anything else, even slight modifications, you can justify. You can come up with data within literature itself that shows that these differences do not affect safety and performance. You can still continue to claim equivalence. Another thing is, I think there is a strong belief that the device has to be CE marked in order to claim equivalence. It's nice to have, it's not mandatory. You have to have a very strong justification for not going with a CE marked device, a non-CE marked device, but it has happened. You can claim equivalence to a non-CE marked device. Not ideal, but it is possible. Given the right justification, you can claim equivalence to a non-CE marked device. Can we go to the next slide, Kelly? So these are some of the notified body expectations that we've seen, and these are the ones that we commonly see coming back as gaps or comments or queries from the notified body. Predominantly that the benefits are not clearly defined, they're not measurable, or the Route 6110, where you're relying on non-clinical data has been incorrectly applied to a device where it's not relevant or it's not applicable. We've used non-clinical data in support of claims where you should have used clinical data to support it. So you've used, say, testing reports, verification, validation, instead of having field data on a specific clinical performance claim or a safety claim. And then this ties into the benefits not being measurable, where we rely on device features rather than clinical performance claims or clinical safety claims. We've also seen several cases where the notified body has come back saying, yes, you have performance claims, but you don't have safety claims in your CR, and you do need to have a safety claim. These can be generic, like my device, is not more risky than what is out there in the market. And when I say more risky, these are the 3 or 4 risks that I'm going to compare against the state of the art, or that I'm going to compare against a similar device to show you that they're at the same range. Similarly, the other one is that the hierarchy of evidence has not been clearly called out. So you have a lot of data sets, but it's not clear, is this sufficient or not? And then the last one, which is not very common, is that there isn't enough evidence to support your safety or performance claims. We can move on to the case studies now. So we have just 3 scenarios where we did where we're going to present as case studies. One, which again, they said the most common one that we commonly encounter is that the benefits are not specific or measurable. So we've come across documents where, yes, they are benefits, but they are really vague and they do not have a quantifiable value associated with it. So proving it becomes very difficult. Or how do we decide, has it really been proved or not? So let's look at case 1, where we're saying that the benefit is it improves first pass success. Yes, that is a benefit. But what do we mean when we say improves? Improves in comparison to what? Improves to what level? So we added a value to it. That's all we did. We did not change any of the data sets. We didn't identify new information. We didn't do anything. All we did was added a value to it. And where we got this value from was from the state of the art. We went through a meta-analysis of all of the similar devices, did a weighted average, and then this is the range that was seen for the similar devices. We're saying we can do that too. We can get it to that level too. If your device has a feature where you're saying it can do better, then set that as the benchmark. So it can do better than improving it to 70%. By how much also you can claim. So I can do 5% better than what's currently in the market. I can do 10% better than what's currently in the market. But we do need to have data to back that up. Similarly, there was a company where we worked on a bone graft substitute where it simply said we provide better bone formation. Again, this is a claim, but it's non-quantified, but it is quantifiable. It's just that it wasn't called out in the first instance. So again, there we did not add any additional information. We didn't do anything extra. All we did was add a value to it, and both of these went through. After round 1, both of these were accepted by the notified body and were closed. They did not ask for additional information. All they wanted to see was, what are you trying to prove exactly? What value, and where is this demonstrated in the CER? Can we go to the next slide, Kelly? So for the next case, what we have is where Route 6110 was actually not applied. So we had a client come to us with a bioprocessing accessory where 6110 was not claimed in the first time. They tried to use a lot of clinical data to support the use of their bag, but based on the intended purpose, based on the patient population, it did not make sense that we went with clinical data. It's really hard to find what kind of outcomes you would look for. So in this scenario, 6110 is appropriate, and here you rely purely on non-clinical data or non-clinical testing that you have in-house, plus PMS information that you have, just to show that there were no issues with the bag when it was used. And again, showing that the 6110 was applicable was by a justification showing that the bag had no patient contact. It was, the 3 or 4 steps down the line to when it was finally utilized within the patient. So there was a lot of confounding factors. Any outcome in the patient could not be directly linked back to the bag. So relying on clinical evidence would skew the data considerably, and it would not make sense to use clinical evidence for support of such a device. So once we did the risk justification and we presented this to the notified body, this route also was accepted and it happened to go through. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, and the last one is, okay, what do we do when we don't have enough data? I think this is worst nightmare for most companies. They don't want to do additional testing. We don't want to spend or hemorrhage a bunch of money on doing clinical studies at this point of time. This is where your SLRs are most important. Um, you have an abundance of data out there for different types of devices, different types of technologies. All we have to do is harness this. And the best way to do that is through an SLR, a well-structured SLR. Now, whether you choose to do it through, finding an equivalent device, whether you choose to do it through saying it's well-established technology, so I want to prove to you that the state of the art is in fact what my device is using, or I just want to, instead of doing 5 years, I want to do 15 years of data, that's fine. But relying on your LSR is the easiest and fastest fix to find more information for your device. Yes, there are scenarios where even the LSR will not be of help, but there you can rely on just showing that you've done the LSR, an extensive LSR. I've done 20 years search. I've done the most generic search strings. I've screened thousands of articles and I still don't have information, is very often sufficient to the notified body that maybe this device doesn't really have that information out there. And then addressing that gap through a small survey, a level 8 survey, surveys based on recall analysis rather than per patient analysis, even that gets accepted by the notified body. So demonstrating that you've done a really good literature search, you've tried to find data, not found it, and then you're relying on not very high quality data, it gets accepted. And I think applying that for for our CERs, especially legacy products or diagnostic products, measurement related devices where you don't have much information out there, or where nobody is really studying these devices at this point of time, this is the best best method, a best trick that you can use, showing that you've done your due diligence and there's not much information out there, but I'm still willing to address it through a user based survey or human factor analysis, something small, something limited, but enough to show that you've done your due diligence, basically. There's also a scenario where you can justify the amount of data you have by using statistics. And this is where the confidence intervals and your statistical methods of analysis comes in. So if there's not enough safety data, you can say by probability analysis, this is maybe how much that risk would have occurred in this population. Therefore, my device is still within the limits as defined in my risk file. So that's where you use your confidence intervals, margins, and your statistics. With that, I think all of the case studies are done. So if anybody has any questions, I think we can. This is the key takeaways, but I think we'll skip that and go to the questions. I think we have only 5 minutes left.
Yeah, and there's already questions, so let's go ahead and jump into that. The first one that came in was, does requiring a quantitative benefit risk assessment imply that a statistical analysis must be performed?
Yes. The notified body will ask you, how is this statistically relevant or valid? It has to be applied. So using a statement that just says, my benefit risk assessment is positive, it's not accepted. There has to be weighted averages, there has to be a meta-analysis, there has to be some kind of statistical evidence to show that your patient numbers, both for benefit and your risk, are statistically significant enough to demonstrate that the benefit risk in fact is positive.
Great, thank you. Next question, how do we handle situations where we have very limited or low quality clinical evidence? And I know that's something that comes up quite a bit.
Yes, so like I said, always highlighting or addressing that gap is important, knowing that we have this gap, calling it out in the CER itself, and then saying, we know that there's this gap and this is what we're planning to do. Either future, this is how we choose to address it through a PMCF, or depending on what your device is used for. Say it's a very rare medical condition, there's not bound to be a lot of information out there. Say it's being utilized for, we had devices that were utilized during wartime chest wounds. So there's not bound to be a lot of information on that either. So calling that out and justifying it also often works. Maybe your device is ethically, it doesn't make sense to use it in testing scenarios. So calling these out, providing justifications for it helps. There's also the case where sometimes we think there's not enough data, but you can work around that by saying you don't need clinical data. You can rely on surrogate endpoints. These are the non-clinical tests that, because we have proved that, in essence, it means that my device is safe and does perform as expected. So just finding that bridge between using what we have versus do we need to generate more information is, yeah, that's the tricky part.
Okay. All right. Very specific question here. Someone is using Article 6110 route for a product. The notified body agreed with us for the approach, but when it went to clinical oversight, they refused the Article 6110 justification because our competitor claimed clinical benefits. Is this something that you've experienced with any of your submissions?
I personally have not seen a notified body say that your competitor has done this, so you have to do it too. But I have seen them say, we've seen studies, like we've seen articles where they have evaluated patient outcomes with your device. So if they're able to evaluate patient outcomes with using your device, then you cannot claim 6110. So if you have included articles in your CER where it says the device was used and then we evaluated did this patient have like successful recovery or not, they're not going to accept 6110. They're going to say clearly it has an effect on patient outcome, clearly it's measurable, so you have to have clinical data to support it.
Okay. What criteria should be considered when developing clinical evidence in the CER for a combination device? So a drug plus a device.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
What criteria should be considered when developing the clinical evidence in the CER for a combination device? So is there anything unique when it's a combination device as opposed to just a straight medical device?
Yeah, for a combination device, there are a number of other factors that need to be considered while you're drafting your CER, because in a sense, it is a drug and a device that's being used together. The level of scrutiny is higher than when it would come to just a plain medical device. It's often important to present as much information as possible on the drug that's being utilized along with your device.
We might have lost you there.
What data do you have to prove that it's safe? Enough information. Oh, sorry. Hello? Am I back? Can you hear me
You
now?
are back. It just froze for a second. No worries. We heard
Sorry.
more data because there's the pharmaceutical component involved as well.
Yep.
And I think we're just about at time. Let's do one last question. This one is for clinical endpoints for class 1 devices. How detailed should this be, especially when data is limited?
I hate class 1 devices. They have the least amount of information. Based on what we've seen, the notified body doesn't look for much either. As long as you can justify why you don't have that information, as long as you can word your way into why this information that you have is sufficient, it usually gets accepted. We did a device, a tongue depressor, and we were like, how do we claim benefits for something as mundane as a tongue depressor? But yeah, the CER went through. There weren't any quantifiable, measurable benefits in the CER. There weren't any clinical evidence for anything. But yeah, they accepted it because we were able to justify why having that did not make sense, or it wouldn't be available for something as simple as a tongue depressor. So yeah, as long as we can justify it, it will go through, especially for a class 1 because it's low risk.
Yeah, and so much of that gets into exactly the risk classification of the device, and then what do you need to support the evidence given that risk.
Yep.
Well, thank you both very much. This was fabulous. Thank you to the audience for those great questions. And with that, we are at time and we'll wrap up.